September 1982. Inside the palace at Monaco, Grace Kelly moved through empty corridors like a woman underwater. Her husband Rainier had stopped speaking to her weeks earlier. Their dinners were silent. Her daughter Caroline would later tell friends that her mother seemed to be fading, not physically, but in some way harder to name. The staff noticed it first. Grace would stand at windows for hours, staring at the harbour where yachts came and went. She'd lost 14 pounds that summer. When visitors arrived, she would compose herself, smile, perform. The moment they left, the mask dropped. Her son Albert found her crying in the library one afternoon. She wouldn't say why. What nobody knew at the time was that the isolation had been building for decades, hidden behind every royal portrait and public appearance. The marriage the world called a fairy tale had become something else entirely, something Grace couldn't escape and couldn't name. The palace wasn't a home, it was a mausoleum, and she was still breathing. But to understand how the fairy tale became a cage, you have to go back to the beginning, to the moment Grace Kelly stopped being a person and became a prize. The Philadelphia girl, Grace Patricia Kelly, was born in Philadelphia in 1929, into a family that had everything except warmth. Her father, Jack Kelly, was a self-made millionaire who'd won 3 Olympic gold medals in rowing. He was also a man who believed affection made children weak. Grace's report cards came back with A's, and he'd ask why they weren't A+. She'd win a school play, and he'd critique her diction at dinner. Her mother Margaret favoured Grace's older sister Peggy, the beauty, the charmer, the one who didn't have to try. Grace was the middle child, quiet and watchful. She learned early that love was something you earned through performance, through becoming flawless enough that even Jack Kelly couldn't find fault. So she trained herself. Posture, diction, poise. She turned herself into a work of art, hoping someone would finally notice. At 18, she told her father she wanted to act. He laughed, said it was a profession for whores. She applied to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts anyway, worked as a model to pay for classes, lived in a Manhattan boarding house where the heat barely worked. Every rejection made her more precise. Every audition sharpened her. She would spend her entire life chasing her father's approval, and that hunger would lead her straight into Rainier's hands. Becoming a star. By 1951, Grace was working steadily on television, then got cast opposite Gary Cooper in High Noon. She was 22. Cooper was 50 and married, but the camera loved what happened between them. Directors started calling. In 1954, Alfred Hitchcock cast her in Dial M for Murder, then Rear Window opposite James Stewart, then To Catch a Thief with Cary Grant. 3 Hitchcock films in 18 months. She had a quality the camera couldn't explain. Icy blonde beauty, yes, but something underneath, a sense that she was holding herself in check, that underneath the gloves and pearls was a woman capable of anything. Hitchcock called her a snow-covered volcano. In 1955, she won the Oscar for The Country Girl. She was 26 years old, and every studio in Hollywood wanted her. She could choose any role, any director, any co-star. But Hollywood was watching her off-screen life just as closely, and what they saw would soon become a scandal. The affairs. Ray Milland was 45, and married when Grace fell for him on the set of Dial M for Murder. The affair was reckless enough that Milland's wife threatened divorce, and the studio pulled Grace from their next picture together to end it. But Grace moved on to Clark Gable during Mogambo, then Bing Crosby during The Country Girl, then William Holden, all married, all leading men. The pattern was so consistent that MGM executives began monitoring her movements on set. Her father, Jack Kelly, read the gossip columns and stopped speaking to her for weeks. He'd built a fortune in Philadelphia through discipline and respectability, and here was his daughter making headlines as a homewrecker. Grace told friends she was looking for someone who could match her intelligence, who wouldn't be intimidated by her success. But every relationship followed the same script: intense, secretive, impossible. Then, in 1955, Grace accepted an invitation that would change everything: a photo opportunity at a palace on the French Riviera. The Prince. Prince Rainier III was 32 years old, ruling a country smaller than Central Park. Monaco covered 0.78 square miles, wedged between the Mediterranean and the French Alps, and it was hemorrhaging money. The casino revenue that had sustained the principality for decades was collapsing. Tourism had dried up. Rainier's subjects numbered fewer than 3,000, and most of Monaco's income came from a single failing enterprise. Worse, a treaty signed in 1918 stated that if Rainier died without a legitimate heir, Monaco would be absorbed into France. He'd been on the throne for 6 years and was still unmarried. The French government was already making plans. Rainier needed 2 things urgently: an heir to secure the succession, and a bride famous enough to put Monaco back on the map, preferably one whose family could inject capital into his crumbling economy. What Grace didn't know was that Rainier wasn't looking for love. He was looking for a solution. The courtship. The meeting was arranged by Father Francis Tucker, an American priest with connections in Hollywood and Monaco, working with Paris Match magazine. Grace arrived at the palace on May 6, 1955, for what was billed as a 15-minute photo session. Rainier gave her a private tour of the palace zoo, speaking fluent English and asking about her films. He was charming, attentive, and unlike the actors she'd known, he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts on politics and history. Grace wrote to a friend that she'd finally met a man who wasn't threatened by her mind, who treated her as an equal. Rainier sent flowers to her hotel that evening, then letters when she returned to America. By December, he sailed to Philadelphia to meet her family, and on January 5, 1956, he proposed with a 10.48-carat emerald-cut diamond. Grace said yes within hours. Within months, Rainier proposed, but the engagement contract contained clauses Grace would never discuss publicly. The dowry. The contract arrived at the Kelly family home in late January. Inside was a clause Grace hadn't expected. The Grimaldi family required a dowry of $2 million. Her father, Jack Kelly, a self-made millionaire who'd built an empire from bricklaying, wrote the check himself. Friends later said he felt humiliated. The Prince of Monaco needed a Hollywood star's father to pay for the privilege of marrying his daughter. MGM saw an opportunity. They agreed to fund the wedding ceremony in exchange for exclusive film rights to the event. The studio would produce a documentary called The Wedding in Monaco and recoup their investment through box office sales. Grace's final performance would be her own wedding. Grace signed the papers, and in doing so, signed away more than her money. Leaving Hollywood. She had 1 film left on her MGM contract. High Society, a musical remake of the Philadelphia story, began shooting in January 1956. Grace played Tracy Lord for the last time, opposite Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra. On set, she told Sinatra she was nervous. He told her not to go. Cary Grant threw her a goodbye party in February. Judy Garland cried. Oleg Cassini, her former lover, begged her to reconsider. Grace smiled and said she was certain. Alfred Hitchcock called her in March. He was preparing to catch a thief's follow-up and wanted her for the lead. Grace said no. Hitchcock asked if Rainier was worth giving up her career. She said she wasn't giving it up, she was trading it for something better. Hitchcock told her she was making a mistake. They never spoke again. She ignored every warning because she believed she was stepping into a love story. The wedding. On April 18, 1956, Grace Kelly walked down the aisle of St. Nicholas Cathedral in a gown designed by MGM's Helen Rose. 125 yards of silk, 25 yards of taffeta, 300 yards of Valenciennes lace. 30 million people watched on television across 9 countries. The streets of Monaco were lined 10 deep. 3,000 journalists covered the ceremony. Grace's bouquet held lilies of the valley and a small prayer book. Rainier stood at the altar in a uniform he'd designed himself, covered in medals from a military career that had never seen combat. The ceremony lasted 45 minutes. Grace said her vows in French without stumbling. When the Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd outside erupted. Confetti rained from the palace balconies. She waved to the cameras, and the world saw a princess. But behind the palace doors, the fairy tale was already beginning to crack. The first night. That night, after the last guest left, Rainier walked Grace to her quarters. He kissed her hand, turned on his heel, and went to his own room on the opposite wing. She stood in the hallway, still in her wedding dress, listening to his footsteps fade. Grace had expected warmth, intimacy, the beginning of a shared life. Instead, she got silence. Rainier kept separate bedrooms, separate schedules, separate lives. He appeared for meals, posed for photographers, then disappeared into his study for hours. When she asked when they'd spend time together, he reminded her that he had a country to run. When she suggested redecorating her rooms, he told her the furniture had been there for 200 years. Every conversation felt like a negotiation with a stranger. Grace began to understand what she'd actually agreed to. This wasn't a marriage in any sense she recognized. It was a position she'd been hired to fill, a role she'd been cast to play. And the contract she had signed made one thing clear: there was no way out. The palace rules. The palace protocol officer handed Grace a 47-page document her first week. It outlined everything she could and couldn't do. No film work, no theatre, no returning to America without the prince's written consent, no personal bank account. Every centime she spent came from an allowance Rainier controlled. She couldn't speak to journalists without approval. She couldn't leave the palace grounds without a security detail reporting her movements. She couldn't invite friends to visit without clearing the guest list through Rainier's secretary. Her calendar filled with ribbon cuttings, hospital visits, charity galas where she smiled and said nothing of substance. She was a decoration, a symbol, a face for the principality. Her job was to look elegant, produce airs, and never cause scandal. Grace read scripts in secret, keeping them hidden in her dresser. She wrote letters to friends in Hollywood, asking about projects, about the life she'd left behind. She never sent them. Grace tried to adapt, but Rainier's family had other plans for her. The Grimaldis. Princess Charlotte, Rainier's mother, made her feelings clear at the first family dinner. She spoke only French, rapid and clipped, then laughed when Grace struggled to follow. Rainier didn't translate. His sisters, Antoinette and Tiny, watched with tight smiles. They mocked her accent behind her back, loud enough for her to hear. They corrected her table manners, her posture, the way she held a teacup. When Grace wore American designers, they called her clothes vulgar. When she wore Dior, they said she was trying too hard. Antoinette told guests at a garden party that actresses were little more than prostitutes with better lighting. Charlotte reminded Grace, often, that Monaco had survived 700 years without Hollywood and would survive long after Grace was forgotten. Rainier never defended her. When Grace complained, he told her she was being oversensitive, that his family took time to warm up to outsiders. But they weren't warming up. They were circling, waiting for her to fail. Grace was drowning in isolation, and then she discovered she was pregnant. Caroline, Princess Caroline Louise Marguerite, was born on January 23, 1957. Monaco erupted. Church bells rang across the principality for hours. Grace had delivered an heir in under a year. Rainier visited her hospital room with flowers. He smiled for the photographers. For 3 weeks, he asked about the baby's sleep, her feeding schedule, whether Grace needed anything. The palace staff whispered that the prince seemed changed. Grace told her sister Lisanne she finally understood her role. She had a daughter who would need her, a purpose beyond standing in receiving lines. She wrote to a friend in Philadelphia that motherhood felt like the first real thing she'd done since arriving. But Rainier had already gotten what he needed from her, and his attention disappeared. The distance grows. Within a month of Caroline's birth, Rainier resumed his old patterns. He dined with a French actress in Nice. He spent weekends at a villa outside Monaco, where his mistress from before the marriage had quietly returned. Grace learned this from a palace gardener, not from her husband. She tried attending his meetings with ministers. Rainier cut her off mid-sentence in front of 6 officials and told her the discussion was not her concern. When she asked why he hadn't mentioned a new tax policy, he told her she had one job and politics wasn't it. The household staff received new instructions. Grace's daily schedule was to be reported to the prince each evening. Her phone calls logged. Her mail opened before it reached her desk. She discovered this when a letter from Cary Grant arrived, with the seal already broken. Grace began writing letters to her Hollywood friends, letters she would later destroy. Albert. Prince Albert Alexandre Louis Pierre was born on March 14, 1958. The cannons at Fort Antoine fired 101 times. Monaco had its male heir, the succession secure. Rainier stood on the palace balcony holding the infant, waving to 12,000 people packed into the square below. He gave a speech praising Grace's devotion to the principality. He declared a national holiday. He commissioned a commemorative coin with Albert's profile. Photographers captured him beaming beside the bassinet, the proud father, the satisfied prince. Grace sat in her bedroom that night and did the math. 2 children in 14 months. The marriage contract's implicit requirement fulfilled. She had given Monaco its future. She had no cards left to play, no leverage to negotiate a different life, no role except the one already defined. That was only round 1. The escape attempt. In 1959, Alfred Hitchcock called. He wanted Grace for Marnie, a psychological thriller about a woman trapped by her past. The fee was $1 million, and Hitchcock offered to shoot around her royal schedule. Grace went to Rainier with the script. She told him it was one film, a farewell, a chance to close the chapter on her own terms. He listened, then said he'd consider it. For weeks, she allowed herself to hope. The news leaked before Rainier gave his answer. Monaco erupted. Newspapers ran editorials asking why their princess needed Hollywood when she had a country to serve. Anonymous letters arrived at the palace, some calling her ungrateful, others questioning her commitment to her children. Rainier summoned her to his office and told her the decision was final. No film, no negotiation. The people had spoken, and he would not make Monaco look foolish. Grace withdrew the request, but something inside her broke. Stephanie. Princess Stephanie was born in February 1965. Grace was 35, exhausted, and had not planned another pregnancy. Rainier had wanted a second son. When the doctor announced a girl, the prince left the hospital without holding her. Rumours spread through Monaco's tight social circles almost immediately. Stephanie looked nothing like Caroline or Albert. Whispers suggested Grace had taken a lover, that the child belonged to someone else. No one said it to Rainier's face, but he heard every word. He treated Stephanie with a coldness that palace staff noticed within days. He refused to be photographed alone with her. At her christening, he stood apart from Grace, his face blank. When visitors cooed over the baby, he changed the subject or walked away. Grace spent hours in the nursery, holding Stephanie long after she'd fallen asleep. She stopped attending dinners unless required. She asked her secretary to cancel appearances, citing exhaustion. By then, Grace had learned the full truth about the man she had married. Rainier's cruelty. Rainier's cruelty arrived in private, in small cuts that left no visible scars. He mocked her pronunciation of French during palace briefings. He interrupted her at state dinners to correct facts she knew were accurate. When dignitaries complimented her, he reminded her later that they were being polite, not truthful. At a 1967 gala, Grace offered an opinion on Monaco's cultural funding during a conversation with the French ambassador. Rainier cut her off mid-sentence, turned to the ambassador, and said, "My wife forgets that looking pretty is her expertise, not policy." The table went silent. Grace smiled and reached for her wine. Behind closed doors, he told her she had no identity beyond what he permitted. She was Princess Grace, not Grace Kelly. That woman was dead, and he'd paid $2 million to bury her. When she wept, he left the room. When she argued, he reminded her that divorce would mean losing her children under Monegasque law. Staff members later described finding Grace alone in hallways, staring at portraits of previous Grimaldi wives, women who had also arrived from elsewhere and never left. She stopped asking Rainier for anything. She stopped expecting apologies. Grace turned to the only escape available to her, and it would destroy her health. The drinking. The palace staff received a quiet instruction in 1964. Keep the princess's quarters stocked with vodka and gin. Don't ask questions. Don't mention it to the prince. Grace drank alone in the afternoons, curtains drawn against the Mediterranean sun. By evening events she'd appear composed, but the slur was there if you listened closely, the way she gripped the banister a moment too long. Rainier saw it. He said nothing. In his world, a wife's private collapse was preferable to public acknowledgement. The photographers never caught her off balance. The illusion held. She'd pour the first drink around 2 p.m., the second by 3. Some nights she'd stand at state dinners with a smile so fixed it looked painted on, her glass of champagne untouched because she'd already had 6 drinks in her room. But alcohol wasn't the only thing Grace was using to numb the pain. The pills. The palace kept 3 doctors on rotation. Each one wrote prescriptions for Valium, Librium, antidepressants with names Grace couldn't pronounce. No single physician saw the full picture. That was the point. Some mornings she couldn't lift her head from the pillow. Caroline would find her at noon, still in bed, the breakfast tray untouched. Grace would smile and say she was tired. Caroline was 11. She knew it wasn't tiredness. By 1967, the children had learned to read the signs. If their mother's words came slow and soft, if her eyes didn't quite focus, they'd retreat to their rooms. Albert once asked a staff member why Mama slept so much. The woman said the princess worked very hard. Grace could have told Rainier she was drowning. She could have asked for help, demanded better doctors, admitted she couldn't do this alone. She didn't. The mask. In public, Grace was flawless. The posture she'd learned at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts never wavered. The smile she'd perfected for Hitchcock appeared on cue. She glided through state visits in Paris, London, Tehran like she'd been born to it. Vogue called her the world's most elegant woman in 1969. Life ran a 12-page spread on her serene life in Monaco. She stood on the palace balcony in Chanel, waving to crowds who believed they were seeing a fairy tale made real. The photographers captured her at charity galas, her hand resting lightly on Rainier's arm, her expression one of quiet contentment. No one saw the tremor in her fingers. No one noticed she wore long sleeves in summer to hide the bruises from stumbling into furniture. She gave interviews about duty and sacrifice and finding joy in service. She said all the right things in that soft, measured voice. The world bought every word. Behind that mask, Grace was planning something Rainier would never forgive. The affair. His name was Robert Dornhelm, a 25-year-old Austrian filmmaker. Grace met him in Paris in 1976 during preparations for a documentary project. He was serious about his work, curious about hers, and he spoke to her as if she still had something to say. They began meeting quietly, a cafe in the 6th arrondissement, a gallery opening where she could slip away from her security detail for 20 minutes. She laughed in a way her staff hadn't heard in years. The affair lasted 8 months. It wasn't reckless, it was careful, deliberate, a small corner of her life where she could remember what it felt like to be chosen for herself. She wrote him letters she never sent, folded them into a leather journal she kept in a locked drawer in her bedroom. For the first time since 1956, Grace looked in the mirror and recognized the woman staring back. But Rainier's network of informants was everywhere, and when he found out, his retaliation was swift. The punishment. Within 48 hours, Grace's household budget was frozen. The account she used for personal expenses, gifts, travel, frozen without explanation. Staff members who had served her for over a decade were reassigned or dismissed. Her private secretary, a woman who'd been with her since 1962, was let go on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 weeks' severance. Rainier installed new palace guards outside her wing. They reported her movements, logged her phone calls, screened her mail. He never confronted her directly. He didn't need to. The message was clear. You are watched, you are contained, and this is what happens when you forget your place. Then came the implicit threat. If she attempted to leave Monaco, if she pursued a separation, he would ensure the children remained with him. Under Monegasque law, he had absolute custody rights. Caroline was 20, but Albert was 19, and Stephanie only 12. Grace understood what he was telling her. She ended the affair. She wrote Dornhelm one final letter, explaining nothing, asking him not to contact her again. Grace submitted, but her relationship with her children began to fracture in ways that would never heal. Caroline's rebellion. Caroline was 16 when she started smoking in palace hallways, skipping state dinners, showing up in paparazzi photos at nightclubs in Paris, wearing clothes her mother would never have approved. It wasn't rebellion for attention, it was rebellion as accusation. She told friends her mother had made a coward's bargain, trading her freedom for a title and condemning her children to the same gilded prison. When Grace tried to intervene, Caroline would remind her, "You chose this, you stayed, you taught us, this is what women do." At 21, Caroline married Philippe Junot, a 38-year-old Parisian playboy with a reputation Grace found appalling. The wedding went forward over her objections. Rainier approved it. Caroline wore a dress deliberately provocative, cut low and tight. She looked directly at her mother during the vows. The marriage lasted 2 years. When it ended, Caroline returned to Monaco bitter and vindicated. Grace tried to protect her daughter from repeating her mistakes, but Caroline saw only betrayal. Albert's silence. Albert watched. He was 13 when Caroline married, 15 when she came home defeated. He learned early that the palace wasn't a home. It was a stage where affection was dangerous, and silence was survival. He stopped speaking at dinner. He stopped asking questions. He became the child who never caused problems, never demanded attention, never took sides. Rainier barely noticed. Grace noticed but couldn't reach him. The distance between them wasn't cruelty, it was strategy. Albert loved his mother with a loyalty he could never articulate, but he'd already made the calculation that would define his life. In a palace where love was weaponized, the safest position was neutrality. He became a ghost in his own family. But it was Stephanie, the youngest, who would pay the highest price for Grace's trapped life. Stephanie's desperation. Stephanie was 7 when Caroline's marriage collapsed. She watched her mother disappear into duties and her father retreat into cold silence. She learned that the only way to be seen was to demand it. By 12, she was skipping classes. By 14, she was sneaking out to nightclubs in Nice, using a fake ID and her famous face. Grace tried discipline, then bargaining, then pleading. Nothing worked. Stephanie wasn't rebelling against rules. She was screaming into a void, testing whether anyone cared enough to stop her. Rainier responded with indifference. Albert responded with silence. The patterns forming in Stephanie were the same ones Grace had buried for 20 years. The hunger for attention, the need to provoke, the willingness to destroy herself if it meant finally being noticed. Grace watched her daughter unravel and recognized herself. The 1970s. Monaco was thriving. The casino revenues hit record highs in 1975. Rainier had spent the decade courting European industrialists and Middle Eastern oil money, remaking the principality into a playground for the ultra-rich. Tax rates stayed at 0%. Real estate prices tripled, and the prince's political capital grew with every new conglomerate that relocated there. Grace's role in this new Monaco was ornamental. She opened hospital wings. She hosted charity auctions. She smiled at banquets where her husband brokered deals she wasn't consulted on. She was 47 in 1976, still beautiful, still photographed, still introduced as the former movie star who became a princess. The emphasis was always on former. She'd stopped asking Rainier for meaningful work. She'd stopped expecting him to see her as anything more than an asset to be displayed. The marriage had settled into a cold routine where they occupied the same palace but lived separate lives. Grace began searching for a way to reclaim some fragment of her old identity and found it in an unexpected place. The poetry readings. In 1976, Grace walked onto a stage in Edinburgh and did something she hadn't done in 20 years. She performed. Not a movie, not a palace speech, but a curated evening of dramatic poetry readings, interpretive pieces she'd chosen and rehearsed in secret. The theatres sold out in hours. Critics praised her pacing, her control, the way she inhabited Yeats and Sandburg without theatrics. One London reviewer wrote that Kelly had traded one kind of performance for another, but this time she'd chosen the material herself. She toured on and off for 5 years, performing in Paris, London, New York. The revenue went to Monaco's arts programs, but Grace kept the reviews in a leather folder in her private office. Friends said she seemed lighter after each tour, like she'd rediscovered a part of herself she thought was gone. But Rainier saw the tours as a humiliation, and he made sure they ended. The end of tours. The palace funding for Grace's tour logistics disappeared without explanation in early 1981. Suddenly there were scheduling conflicts, official Monaco events that required her presence on the exact dates she'd booked venues. Rainier never issued a direct order, he just made it impossible. In June 1981, the palace released a statement saying the princess needed to devote more time to her family obligations. Grace's final poetry reading was in London that October, a small charity event she'd committed to months earlier. She performed Edna St. Vincent Millay, her voice steady, her hands shaking. A photographer caught her backstage afterward, sitting alone in full makeup, staring at nothing. The tour organizers had already been told there wouldn't be a next season. Grace folded the itinerary into her bag and flew back to Monaco the next morning. By then, Grace had stopped fighting, and something far more dangerous had taken root. The resignation. Grace in 1982 looked like a woman performing her own life. She attended state dinners with perfect posture and blank eyes. She smiled for photographers at the Rose Ball, said the right things to dignitaries, cut ribbons at hospital openings. Friends who visited Rock Aigle that summer used the same word, ghost. Judith Balaban Quine, her closest friend from the Hollywood years, said Grace moved through rooms like she was reading stage directions she'd memorized decades ago. There was no improvisation left, no spark. She answered questions a beat too late, as if translating from a language she no longer spoke fluently. Her secretary noticed she'd stopped making plans past October. No theatre bookings, no travel, no commitments for the holidays. When asked about Christmas arrangements, Grace said she'd think about it later. She never did. And then, in September 1982, Grace made a decision that would end everything. The drive. On September 13, 1982, Grace woke at Rock Aigle, the family's mountain retreat above Monaco. She told the staff she'd drive herself and Stephanie down to the palace. The chauffeur offered, as always. Grace refused. This wasn't protocol. Princesses didn't drive themselves on public roads, especially not the serpentine descent from Rock Aigle. The staff noticed something else. Grace seemed distracted, her movements slower than usual, but she insisted. The road was 8 miles of hairpin turns dropping 1,300 feet. Grace had driven it 1,000 times. She knew every curve, every blind corner. She got into the Rover 3500 with Stephanie beside her and started the engine. They left around 9:30 a.m. The morning was clear, visibility perfect. Grace handled the first few turns without incident. Then, somewhere near the village of La Turbie, something changed. What happened in the final minutes before the crash would haunt Stephanie for the rest of her life. The crash. The Rover missed a hairpin turn on the D37. No skid marks, no sign Grace had braked. The car went through a retaining wall and plunged 120 feet down a steep embankment, rolling multiple times before coming to rest in a farmer's garden. A local gardener named Sesto Lecquio heard the crash. He ran to the wreckage and found Stephanie trapped in the passenger seat, conscious but injured. Grace was slumped over the wheel, unresponsive. Lecquio called for help. Emergency crews arrived within minutes. They pulled Stephanie out first, her collarbone broken, her face cut. Then they extracted Grace. She was alive but barely breathing. The ambulance took 25 minutes to reach Princess Grace Hospital in Monaco. Grace never regained consciousness. She died the next day, September 14th, with Rainier at her bedside. She was 52 years old. The official story was immediate, but the evidence suggested something else entirely. The stroke theory. The palace released a statement within hours. Grace had suffered a minor stroke while driving. The stroke caused her to lose control of the vehicle. It was a medical event, tragic but unavoidable. The international press accepted the narrative without question. No autopsy was performed. Monaco law didn't require one, and Rainier refused to authorize it. The palace cited the family's grief and Grace's Catholic faith. Within 4 days, preparations began for a state funeral built entirely around the stroke story. The stroke theory explained everything cleanly. Why there were no skid marks, why Grace hadn't braked, why a woman who'd driven that road 1,000 times had suddenly veered off. It was medical, it was sudden, it was no one's fault. The world moved on. But Stephanie was in the car. She saw what happened in those final seconds, and from her hospital bed, 17 years old with a broken collarbone, she tried to tell a different version. But Stephanie told a different story, one the palace refused to let her share. Stephanie's account. In the interviews Stephanie gave years later, once she was free of palace control, the story changed. She insisted she'd been driving. Grace had been giving her a routine lesson on the way back from Rock Agil, the family farm in the hills above Monaco. The stroke, Stephanie said, happened after the crash, not before. Her mother had been conscious, lucid, sitting in the passenger seat when the rover went off the road. The medical records from Princess Grace Hospital were sealed within hours of her arrival. Palace officials told Stephanie to stay quiet. She was 17, grieving, and they made it clear the narrative was already set. If she contradicted it, she'd be blamed for her mother's death. So Stephanie stayed silent for years while the world repeated Rainier's version. And then there was the third theory, the one no one would say aloud. The suicide question. Grace's closest friends, the ones who'd known her since Hollywood, began whispering in the months after the funeral. She'd been different in the final weeks, withdrawn, talking about endings. Gwen Robbins, her biographer and confidant, said Grace had mentioned feeling trapped, exhausted by the performance. Judith Balaban-Quine, a bridesmaid from the wedding, said Grace had stopped talking about the future entirely. The road Grace took that day wasn't the usual route from Rock Agil. It was steeper, narrower, a switchback descent she'd driven 1,000 times. She knew every turn. She knew what would happen if you missed one at speed. Friends asked why she'd chosen that road when an easier route existed. No one had a good answer. The palace would spend decades burying that possibility, but the evidence was there. The final weeks. In August 1982, Grace wrote letters to friends in California. She started several, crossed out entire paragraphs, and tore them up. Staff found the scraps in her wastebasket, but never pieced them together. She had conversations that, in hindsight, read like goodbyes. She told one friend she was tired of pretending. She told another she'd done everything she was supposed to do, and it still wasn't enough. At the time, they thought she meant the poetry tour Rainier had just cancelled. Her secretary noticed Grace stopped making plans past September. No appointments, no commitments, nothing scheduled for October or beyond. When asked, Grace said she needed rest first. Caroline later said her mother seemed distant in those final weeks, like she was already somewhere else. Grace Kelly died on September 14, 1982, one day after the crash, but the truth about that drive would remain hidden for decades. The funeral. September 18, 1982. Monaco's cathedral held 400 guests, with thousands lining the streets outside. Cary Grant sat near James Stewart. Diana Ross wept openly. The Aga Khan, the Begum Aga Khan. Nancy Reagan representing the United States. Rainier walked behind the coffin in full military dress, his face a mask of devastation. Caroline, 25, held Albert's arm. Albert, 24, stared straight ahead. Stephanie, 17, was still in the hospital with a broken vertebra, a concussion, and injuries that would take months to heal. The cameras captured every angle of the prince's grief. He touched the casket. He covered his face. The world saw a man destroyed by the loss of his soulmate. But as the world mourned the princess, the palace was already rewriting her story. The sanitized legacy. Within days, the narrative locked into place. Grace Kelly, the Hollywood star who became a real princess. The fairy tale bride who chose love over fame. The elegant icon who lived her dream. Magazine covers reprinted the 1956 wedding photos. Television specials showed clips from Rear Window and To Catch a Thief, then dissolved to footage of Grace in tiaras, waving from balconies. The official biography emphasized her charity work, her devotion to her children, her grace under pressure. What vanished from the record was everything else. The 1960s depression, the blocked film offers, the poetry readings where she recited Yeats with tears in her eyes, the friends who said she felt caged, the interviews where she called her life a collection of memories. Rainier controlled that narrative with an iron grip, and he had decades to perfect it. Rainier after Grace. Rainier never remarried. He kept Grace's rooms exactly as she'd left them, her perfume bottles on the dresser, her clothes in the closet. He gave interviews about how much he missed her. Every November 12, their anniversary, he laid flowers at her tomb. The press called him the eternal widower, a man broken by love. He attended state functions alone. He aged visibly. By the 1990s, he rarely left the palace. To the world, he was proof that some marriages really were perfect, that some losses were too great to recover from. But the private Rainier told a different story. He never apologized for blocking her films. He never acknowledged her unhappiness. He spoke of their marriage as a great success, a partnership that elevated Monaco. Grace had given him 3 children, international prestige, and decades of stability. He'd gotten exactly what he needed, but Grace's children would eventually tell a different story. Caroline speaks. Caroline started talking in the 1990s. Not confessionals, just careful cracks in the official story. She described her mother's marriage as difficult. She said Grace had struggled with the loss of her career, that Monaco had felt like a cage. In a 2002 interview with Paris Match, Caroline went further. She said her mother had been deeply unhappy in the final years, that the fairy tale was exactly that, a story for public consumption, that Grace had confided in her daughters about regrets she could never voice publicly. Caroline refused to perpetuate the myth. She wouldn't say her mother's life had been perfect, wouldn't pretend the palace had been anything other than what it was. She gave interviewers just enough truth to disturb the legend. Albert, as the reigning prince, chose a different path: silence. Albert's silence. Prince Albert II has never publicly acknowledged his mother's private suffering. Every statement, every commemoration, every anniversary speech maintains the official narrative. Grace Kelly, beloved princess, devoted wife, tragic accident. He's repeated the pattern. Albert's own marriage to Charlene Wittstock in 2011 echoed his parents' dynamic almost exactly. A commoner, a former athlete, isolated in Monaco, visibly miserable at public events. Charlene tried to flee 3 days before the wedding. The palace brought her back. Albert has 2 acknowledged illegitimate children, both born before his marriage, both kept at arm's length from the succession. He's preserved the institution exactly as Rainier taught him: the throne, the continuity, the silence about what it costs. But it was Stephanie who would finally reveal the full weight of what Grace had endured. Stephanie's confession. Stephanie broke in 2002. She told a French magazine the truth about September 13, 1982. She'd been driving the Rover, not Grace. She was 17, unlicensed, and her mother had been in the passenger seat. The palace had forced her to stay silent for 20 years. Stephanie described the moments before the crash. Grace wasn't giving directions or warning about the road. She was talking about leaving, about finally walking away from Rainier, from Monaco, from the marriage. Stephanie said her mother's voice had been calm, decided. The stroke, if there was one, came after those words. Stephanie remembered her mother going quiet, slumping forward, the wheel jerking left. She grabbed for it, but the car was already over the edge. And then Stephanie said the thing the palace had feared most, that her mother had wanted to die. The core secret. So here's what we actually know, not from tabloids, not from palace press releases, but from the people who lived it. Grace Kelly's marriage wasn't a love story. It was a transaction that became a trap. Rainier didn't cherish her. He controlled her movements, her friendships, her career, her children. He used isolation as a weapon and the palace as a cage. When she tried to return to acting in 1962, he shut it down. When she wanted to visit America, he limited the trips. When she spoke to journalists, he reviewed the transcripts. And the crash, September 13, 1982. Either Grace had a stroke because the stress had destroyed her body, or she chose that cliff because 26 years of performance had finally broken her will. Those are the only 2 explanations that fit the evidence. Grace Kelly spent 26 years as Princess of Monaco, and every single one of them was a performance. The Hidden Diaries. In 2014, a biographer named Robert Lacey revealed something the palace had kept quiet for 32 years. Grace had kept diaries. detailed daily diaries throughout her entire marriage, documenting what really happened behind the palace walls. When Grace died, Rainier went through her private papers. He found the diaries, and he burned them. Not archived, not sealed, burned, along with most of her personal letters, her working scripts, anything that carried her unfiltered voice. But fragments survived. Letters to Judith Balaban Quine, her closest friend from Hollywood. Letters to her sister Peggy. In them, Grace described Rainier's rages, his jealousy, his need to diminish her. She wrote about feeling erased, about missing her old life, about the suffocating weight of the role she'd been forced to play. Those diaries would have changed history, which is exactly why Rainier burned them. The financial reality. Now let's talk about the money, because this is where the fairy tale collapses completely. Grace Kelly was one of the highest-paid actresses in Hollywood when she married. She'd earned over $1.05 million by 1956, real money. Her family paid a $2 million dowry to Monaco. She never saw any of it again. Rainier controlled every account, every transaction. Grace had no independent income, no access to her own earnings, no financial autonomy whatsoever. Biographer Wendy Lee uncovered palace documents showing that Grace received an allowance, like a child. If she wanted to buy a dress or send money to a friend, she had to ask permission. By the late 1970s, Grace was trying to return to work not for artistic fulfillment, but because she needed her own money. Rainier blocked it every time. She was functionally a dependent in her own marriage, with no legal standing and no means of escape. Monaco law gave wives no property rights. Divorce would have meant losing her children and leaving with nothing. Grace Kelly traded her freedom for a title and spent the rest of her life paying for it. The pattern. Grace's trap wasn't unique. Princess Margaret gave up the man she loved for the crown. Princess Diana fought the same battles 20 years later, with the same palace machinery crushing her. Farah in Iran, Soraya in Persia before her, they all discovered the same truth. The fairy tale was a contract, and the terms were always the same. You marry the institution, not the man. You surrender your passport, your bank account, your freedom of movement. The palace controls your schedule, your friendships, your medical care. Your children belong to the state. Your image becomes property. One former princess called it voluntary incarceration with a tiara. European royal houses in the 1950s operated like medieval fiefdoms wrapped in modern PR. They needed heirs and they needed glamour, but they feared independence. A wife with her own money, her own career, her own identity, that was dangerous. Better to isolate her, exhaust her, make her completely dependent. But Grace's story was unique in one devastating way. The world watched her become a prisoner and called it a dream come true. The price. The films she never made haunt cinema history. Hitchcock wrote Marnie for her in 1964, the role of a damaged woman seeking redemption. Grace read the script in Monaco and wept. She begged Rainier to let her do it. He refused. Tippi Hedren got the part, and Grace watched from the palace, 32 years old and finished. Her body broke under the strain. The migraine started in her late 30s, vicious attacks that left her bedridden for days. Her blood pressure climbed. She gained weight from stress and unhappiness, then starved herself before public appearances. Palace doctors prescribed sedatives. By 50, she was on a cocktail of medications just to function. Her children barely knew her. Caroline was raised by nannies and sent to boarding school at 7. Albert learned to stay silent and invisible. Stephanie grew up wild, the only one who fought back, and Grace didn't know how to reach her. The palace schedule allowed 30 minutes of family time per day, always supervised, always formal. The creativity died slowly, then all at once. She stopped reading scripts in 1968, stopped attending film festivals in 1971. By the end, she couldn't even watch her old movies without crying, and the question no one could answer, whether she would have chosen differently if she had known. The alternate path. Hitchcock believed she would have won 3 Oscars by 1970. He had projects lined up, roles written specifically for her range. The Ice Queen facade hiding volcanic emotion. That was her signature. and American cinema in the 1960s needed exactly that. Imagine Grace Kelly in Rosemary's Baby, in The Graduate, in Bonnie and Clyde. She would have aged into character roles: the elegant matriarch, the woman who'd seen everything, Katharine Hepburn's path but warmer, Bette Davis's power but softer. Directors who worked with her said she was just beginning to understand her instrument. At 26, she was technically perfect. At 36, she would have been transcendent. And she would have been free. Her own money, her own home, her own choices. She could have married for love or not married at all. Could have raised children on her terms or focused entirely on work. Could have traveled, created, lived. The Philadelphia girl who conquered Hollywood on talent alone would have kept conquering. Instead, Grace Kelly became a symbol, but not the one the world thinks. The real legacy. The legacy isn't a love story, it's a transaction ledger. Grace Kelly traded her identity for a title, her career for a crown, her autonomy for the approval of a man who needed her more than she ever needed him. She became the template for every woman told that marriage is the ultimate achievement, that beauty is currency, that a ring matters more than a resume. The fairy tale sold to generations of girls wasn't inspiration, it was a warning, dressed in Dior. Grace spent 26 years proving she could be perfect, perfect wife, perfect mother, perfect princess, and perfection killed her. Not the steering wheel, not the stroke, the exhaustion of performing a role with no exit clause. Grace Kelly is remembered as a princess, but she died as a prisoner. The daughters. Caroline married 3 times. Each husband she chose herself. She negotiated her own terms, kept her own money, and when the first marriage collapsed after 2 years, she walked without apology. No palace required her to stay. Stephanie Ran married her bodyguard in 1995, divorced him 10 months later, joined a circus, had children with an elephant trainer, lived in a Paris apartment far from the palace, raising her kids without protocol officers or state dinners. She chose chaos over captivity. Both women watched their mother disappear into a role. Caroline once told a biographer that Grace's saddest quality was her inability to say no. Stephanie said her mother taught her what not to become. They learned by watching what silence costs. Grace's suffering was not meaningless. It taught her daughters the one lesson she learned too late. Monaco today, the Palais Princier still sells the story. 300,000 tourists a year walk through the state apartments, past the gallery of Grace's Givenchy gowns, the Cartier tiara, the wedding photos backlit like religious icons. The gift shop stocks replicas of her engagement ring for €45. In 2017, the palace opened a permanent Grace Kelly exhibit. Her Hermes bags behind glass, her scripts from To Catch a Thief displayed like artifacts. The placard calls her life a modern fairy tale. It does not mention the diaries. It does not mention the escape fund. Monaco's tourism bureau generates €78 million annually. Grace's face is on half the brochures. The principality built its brand on her image, then locked the complicated woman behind it in an archive the family controls. The fairy tale pays, the truth doesn't. Monaco made a fortune from Grace Kelly's beauty and hid the price she paid for it. The documentaries. In 2014, Nicole Kidman played Grace Kelly in Grace of Monaco, a film so unflattering that the Grimaldi family tried to block its release. It showed a woman trapped, controlled, performing. The palace called it fiction. That same year, biographer J. Randy Taraborelli published Once Upon a Time, the first major work to interview palace staff on the record. They described a marriage of separate bedrooms, scripted appearances, a woman who wept in private. Monaco's official historians called him a liar. By 2022, archival footage began circulating online. Grace at 50, in an interview 3 months before her death, her face drawn, her hands trembling slightly. Asked if she was happy, she paused for 7 seconds before answering. The palace removed the video within 48 hours. The official narrative has cracked, but it hasn't broken. But even now, decades after her death, the full story remains incomplete, because the palace still controls the archive. What remains hidden? Grace Kelly's medical records from 1956 to 1982 are sealed in the Monaco State Archives. So is the complete police report from September 13, 1982, including witness testimony from the scene and the toxicology results. Rainier's personal papers, his correspondence with Grace, the household logs from the palace, all remain classified. The staff who worked at Rock Agile, the country house where Grace spent her final years, signed non-disclosure agreements that survive their deaths. Their children cannot speak. The chauffeur who found the car testified once, then disappeared from public record. In 2017, investigative journalists filed a Freedom of Information request for documents related to Grace's death. Monaco's government denied it on grounds of national security. The theory that Grace drove off that cliff intentionally cannot be proven, but it also cannot be disproven, because the evidence is locked away. Grace Kelly's real story may never be fully known, but what we do know is enough. The final payoff. Grace Kelly's marriage was darker than anyone knew, not because of one hidden scandal, but because the entire structure was darkness. The control, the financial dependence, the isolation, the scripted life, the absence of choice. It was all there, visible, celebrated as romance. She was 26 when she married Rainier, a movie star at the peak of her power. She was 52 when she died, a woman who had spent half her life performing a role she couldn't escape. The fairy tale was the trap. The palace was the cage. The crown was the price. Hollywood made her famous. Monaco made her a prisoner. And the world called it love because it looked beautiful from the outside. Grace Kelly didn't lose herself in a marriage. She was erased by one, methodically, over 26 years. On September 13, 1982, she drove herself down a mountain road she'd driven 100 times before. Whether she lost control or chose to, we'll never know. But we know this: she was finally alone. The human detail. On the morning of September 13, 1982, Grace Kelly wore a simple blue dress she had bought herself on a rare, unsupervised trip to Paris the year before. It was the only piece of clothing in her wardrobe that Rainier had not approved. She chose it for the drive. Not the Dior, not the Givenchy, not any of the 300 outfits the palace had catalogued and monitored. A $60 cotton dress from a shop near the Seine, purchased on an afternoon when her handlers lost track of her for 90 minutes. That's what Grace Kelly's marriage really was. 26 years of needing permission, and one blue dress she picked herself. The fairy tale was a contract, the princess was a prisoner, and the price was everything she had been before. If this story showed you something you didn't know, subscribe. There are more lives like this, more secrets behind the images we thought we understood.